Hello, everyone. I'm Todd Michney. I am a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, but I am actually born and raised in Cleveland. And I wrote a book called Surrogate Suburbs, which is a history of Cleveland's Black middle class. And I'm actually right now focusing on redlining as my new research project. So I'm really happy to be able to tell you about some of the new findings and give you maybe more detail than what comes through in the series.
Yeah, because the one article that we have on redlining is one of the shorter ones and basically does talk about Atlanta, among other places, but talks about the freeway that they're putting in. Is that correct? So maybe you could touch on that. Yeah.
I really enjoyed reading that article myself and Kevin Cruz's work. Very astute. He's written a book called White Flight, which talks about the history of Atlanta. And I think when we talk about redlining, we could talk more generally about the kinds of urban disinvestment practices that would include things like freeways and urban renewal. But more technically, redlining is the targeted denial of financial and other resources, typically loans on either residential mortgages or on insurance coverage. It's also been applied to things like internet service. There's actually a finding in Cleveland of denial of broadband service on the basis that looked very much kind of to follow racial lines. So I think that we use it as shorthand to refer it more generally to these types of practices, but I today wanted to get into some of the more specific history of redlining, and especially comparing how the government and private industry have used that particular practice.
Yeah, that's interesting because we think of pretty much like city planners and the way neighborhoods are constructed, but I hadn't even thought about internet service providers, and bus lines are one thing that obviously come up all the time. But so maybe, yeah, you could just kind of delve into it and let us know what you have found.
Well, again, this is an idea that profits can be maximized by targeting services, and that by avoiding certain areas, profits can be maximized or risks can be avoided. And not surprisingly, a lot of times that follows lines of racial prejudice and a lot of assumptions about what kinds of people are more likely to pay or more likely to keep their jobs. So really, I mean, this comes out of racism and racial prejudice. It gets more disturbing when it starts to become official policy, or, as I could tell you a little bit about, economic theory, because at the time when these ideas were becoming common in the real estate industry and academia in the 1920s and 30s, this was a time of scientific racism, things like eugenics, and there's an idea that these were ironclad economic laws and that this was common sense. I think we've become more enlightened, not to say that racism doesn't still exist, but a lot of the assumptions on which these decisions were originally made have been completely debunked. However, these same sorts of practices continue to be used to this very day by banks, not so much by the government, as I can explain, although there's a lack of enforcement. If we really want to eradicate redlining practices, we need to fully fund and be vigilant, because banks and other lenders and providers are always coming up with new ways to deny services in ways that are unfair and unequal and racist, right? So one focus for the conversation today will be a New Deal government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. And HOLC is probably the most notorious for redlining because they conducted a city survey, as they called it, and that lasted from 1935 to 1940. And they did studies of over 200 cities around the country, really every city over 40,000 residents, with a couple exceptions. And the most kind of striking aspect of these reports were these maps on which they outlined neighborhoods and colored them according to what they believed was the presumed risk of mortgage lending in those neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods they considered the riskiest were outlined in red. So that's where the term redlining comes from. And HOLC didn't actually invent this. Insurance companies were actually using this practice already in the 1920s. Those were large institutional lenders that had a national lending presence at a time when most mortgage lending was on a local or even a face-to-face basis. So it was really these large institutions that started to think in these terms of how can we maximize our profits and limit who's going to be able to get these kinds of loans. And there were other government agencies too we can talk about, like the Federal Housing Administration, that use similar kind of racially informed practices. So really, we're talking about some 30 years from 1935 until 1968, when the government either officially promoted this kind of racist policy, or at least looked the other way. After the Supreme Court issued a ruling that we can talk about in 1948, the government started backing away from promoting, but it continued to just fully fund private developers who discriminated. So it really wasn't until the Fair Housing Act in 1968 when this became illegal, and until the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, when the government started to try and reverse the flow and try and redirect some of these investment flows back into the areas that had been cut off from aid.
Okay, and I just to kind of backtrack a little bit, when you're saying mortgages and investment, you're talking about banks giving loans to small businesses and homeowners, or is it more widespread or more narrow than that?
I must confess my own expertise is on residential home mortgages. The programs that we'll talk about did not cover small businesses, but the term absolutely applies to businesses as well. And when redlining became discovered in the late 60s and 1970s, many scholars found evidence of denial of loans to businesses. So again, we're getting back into this: how broad do we want to use the term to refer? Do we want to use to all sorts of unfair practices of disinvestment, or do we want to be more focused on things like what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did?
Right. And the government determined neighborhoods. Is that how this started? Or was it, how did they determine where because I mean, it seems like at this point, segregation was still incredibly prevalent. So it would be easy to say the Black neighborhood doesn't get homeowners loans, correct? Or how did they break it down?
It's a complicated story. And a lot of what we've been doing is kind of trying to revisit that and find ways to explain it in all of its nuances. If you look back before the New Deal, you're absolutely right that racism was prevalent, segregation was common, but in certain ways, it actually became worse with redlining. And this is one of the more controversial assertions. If you look at something like the Black-white wealth gap, that's actually yawned wider and wider since the 1930s. And it's led some observers to say that these kinds of practices were even more damaging to African-American financial well-being than slavery itself. In other words, coming out of slavery, poor whites and poor Blacks were not that far separated as they later became. And this government-backed policy of redlining created kind of an affirmative action program for whites and a way for working class whites in particular to own homes and own homes that would appreciate in value. And so by the time we reach the current day, there's this huge racial wealth gap that is even more than it was in 1865 when slavery was abolished. So, okay, so in certain ways, the New Deal made things actually worse. Before the 1930s, there were various different attempts to enforce segregation. Some cities passed ordinances like Baltimore and St. Louis, but in 1917, the Supreme Court, in a decision called Buchanan versus Worley, found it was unconstitutional to use race-based zoning. So that meant that cities and developers had to find a different way to try and enforce this. And the most common method was what's called a deed restriction or a restrictive covenant. And this is basically something in the deed, or if it's a restrictive covenant, it happens after the fact. It's not in the deed, but white property owners come together and agree. They sign a covenant saying, we're not going to sell to Black people. And if anyone does, we can sue them. And these were not always enforced. Sometimes when African Americans were able to move into a new area, white people would want to leave. And if they then had these restrictions, they wouldn't be able to unload their property quickly enough. So the idea was mainly as a threat. And if there was maybe just one Black family that bought, they could put pressure on that white family to back out of the sale. Or, and sometimes they would resort to, in fact, often they would resort to violent intimidation if these legal devices didn't work. In 1925, actually, there were 2 cases in Cleveland. In the Wade Park area, near University Circle, Dr. Charles Garvin bought a house. Actually, he was building a house in the Wade Park allotment. And angry neighbors dynamited his house 3 different times, trying to drive him out. And he just stayed put. He refused to be intimidated. He finished building the house and lived there for the rest of his life. But in Shaker Heights that same year, another African-American doctor moved in, and angry whites broke all the windows in the house and actually intimidated the family to the point where they decided to move back to Cleveland and not even try and live in Shaker Heights. And after that, what happened in Shaker Heights was they didn't originally have deed restrictions. They had these restrictive covenants that go in after the fact. After that incident, the Shaker Heights developers, the Van Swerningen brothers, asked for all the deeds back so they could be reissued with these more ironclad racial restrictions forbidding the sale, not just to African Americans, but to Jews in this case as well. So you can see that where this is going.
Right.
But really, if there was enough Black families moving into an area, there wasn't really any easy way to prevent that, other than the ones I just mentioned. So by having the government get involved and start making decisions about who can get loans or not get loans, it provided a more far-reaching and a more kind of standardized means of exclusion. Because another thing you have to keep in mind is different cities had different patterns. There were some small cities like Kalamazoo, Michigan, where there's such a small Black population, maybe one family moving in didn't cause white people to freak out in all cases. In southern cities, the patterns were much more checkerboard, and there were more possibilities for Black families to get financing. So if you look on the local level, you saw different patterns of segregation depending on whether you were looking at north, south, west, what the percentage of Black population was. Now that you have the federal government coming up with this comprehensive kind of idea of how to rate neighborhoods by risk and to penalize those neighborhoods that are Black, you have a much stronger tool than you had before. So that's that. I guess that would be the first way to kind of start talking about that.
All right, can you tell me more about the homeowners loan corporation city survey project? I know they're digitized online, the redlining maps on Mapping Inequality website, but also undesigned the Redline exhibit, which has been touring cities, and I think it even came to Cleveland. So if you could talk more about that.
Mm-hmm. The Homeowners Loan Corporation City Survey Project, which ran from 1935 to 1940, is probably the best known example of redlining, and it's also the best documented. That's one reason why I focused my attention there. And they had a 4-color scheme for rating neighborhoods that had a series of 4 associated letters and also some language. So let me just kind of give you a sense of when you see one of these maps, what you're looking at. So you can kind of get a sense of what they had in mind when they did this. So the green neighborhoods were so-called A neighborhoods, and the language that they associated with that was the best neighborhoods or the first grade neighborhoods. These were typically areas of new residential construction at the time the maps were made, so less than 10 years old. These would have been single family house districts They would have had all the modern amenities, running water, sewers, electricity. They would have been more planned, like standard lot sizes, standard frontages, maybe amenities like parks. They would have been, or I should say, they were inhabited by the native-born white, middle, and upper classes. And native-born is an important distinction because Southern and Eastern European immigrants were looked down upon to some extent at this time, and were not considered as desirable by these native-born whites as neighbors. They were not considered as undesirable as African Americans, but they were still kind of not quite worthy to live in these top-rated areas. And very importantly, these green neighborhoods, in almost every case, had those deed restrictions that were written right into the deed, saying that these properties cannot be sold to Negroes or members of the Mongolian race on the West Coast. Sometimes Jews and even Italians might be included in there. But these were highly restricted properties intended for the well-to-do. Then you had blue neighborhoods, and these were kind of the neighborhoods where that same population had lived previously. So maybe houses that were a little older, maybe up to 30 years old. Maybe they didn't have the same level of amenities. Maybe they had racial restrictions that had been put in place after the fact that were expiring. If you look at some of these descriptions that go with the map, sometimes they'll say things like restrictions are expiring in 1950. So they were considered not quite as good, still good. Some of the terms that were associated were still good or second grade. And another thing you'll see is that the blue areas tend to border the green areas. You don't ever really see an example of a red neighborhood bordering a green one, or very seldom would you even see a yellow one bordering a green one. So there's kind of progression here. The yellow or the C neighborhoods were termed declining or third grade neighborhoods. These were typically inhabited by working class whites, and especially the more recent Southern and Eastern European immigrant groups. And they would have had a mixture of housing types. They might have duplexes, so not just one family housing, but some two family or even four family, or maybe even multiple family housing. Some of these immigrant groups would sometimes build a second house on the back of the lot, and that was considered a real no-no by these real estate professionals and planners. That was a kind of overcrowding and a non-standard use of space. A lot of these neighborhoods were built on a house-by-house basis, so they didn't always have the same frontage, the same design, or similar design. It was basically whatever the families could afford. Sometimes these houses were built by the owners themselves. And so they were considered to be shoddily built, wouldn't hold their value as long. And then finally, the red neighborhoods, or D neighborhoods, were called hazardous in fourth grade. And they were basically the same as the yellow neighborhoods, but considered even more risky for investment. They were also very largely unplanned, self-built housing, but they often would have also an industrial facility nearby. They would have sometimes transportation infrastructure, like high traffic roads or railroad tracks. And not every red neighborhood was a black neighborhood. That's a major misconception having to do with redlining. However, almost virtually every black neighborhood was rated red. And so this is the distinction. And so again, there's this progression, this idea that these neighborhoods move through this kind of life cycle. In fact, social scientists at the time thought there was this inevitable ecological theory whereby neighborhoods would be inhabited by lower and lower income and lower class groups of people. It's interesting, where does this leave the black middle class? Because if you were to look on the Cleveland map and look at Glenville, in the 1930s, this was still a middle class, mostly Jewish. It was only about 2% African American at that point. And really only the highest income black families lived there: doctors, lawyers, business owners. And if you look at the Glenville, it's completely marked red. There's just an assumption it's inevitably going to decline, going to become a slum, going to be inhabited by lower income groups. And, you know, it kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy because, you know, when this word gets around that this area is unsafe for investment, then that kind of, you know, leads to that very same outcome that was proposed. But, you know, at the time they're doing that, it's nothing like that. The houses are in good repair. The groups are middle income groups. So that kind of gives you a sense of really just how detrimental these kinds of practices could be. There are also some red neighborhoods that were not inhabited by African Americans in Cleveland. If you look at Lakewood, there's a cluster of Slovak immigrants. There's a neighborhood there called Birdtown because all the street names are named after birds. And it's marked red, and it's called a Slavish Polish neighborhood. It's actually a Slovak neighborhood. So again, not all these red neighborhoods were Black neighborhoods, but virtually all the Black neighborhoods were marked red.
And this all came out of the HOLC's city survey?
Right. So the city survey is interesting because, you know, again, we found out more about this than other forms of redlining. We didn't find out about other forms of redlining until, we actually didn't find out about this one until the late 60s. So just to kind of get into some of the misconceptions going along with this. The Homeowners Loan Corporation did not itself use these maps to deny its loans. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, for the first 2 years it existed, issued refinancing loans that allowed people to stay in their houses. And I was just a co-author of an article where we found that 25,000 African-American families got refinancing aid through these HOLC loans. So it's a complicated question because when we look at those maps, and again, redlining is kind of a shorthand for disinvestment in general, we assume those particular maps were being used for that purpose. That was not the case. However, HOLC shared those maps with the Federal Housing Administration, which was its successor, and it quite likely used maps for that purpose. HOLC also had other ways of getting out the theories behind this. Just to give you some sense, they published the appraisal forms that they used so that private real estate interests could also copy those. They talked about this project. Even though they didn't share the maps themselves, they published articles explaining how you could make these so-called security maps. They even showed them in public on occasion. I've got some documented instances at conferences where they're showing an exam, they're pointing and using it as a visual aid, and they say, well, we can't give you a copy of this, but you get the idea, and we can actually tell you how you can make your own. They conducted actual workshops and trainings where they taught real estate appraisers, members of the Society of Residential Appraisers and the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, how to make these kinds of maps and use this method. And then finally, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was a temporary agency. Unlike the Federal Housing Administration, which is still with us to this day, they were really just trying to save the country's housing market during the Depression. They liquidated HOLC by 1951. So as HOLC was downsizing, many thousands of those appraisers who'd worked on appraising properties and applying these theories went back out into private industry. So there are many other ways that these methods went out. They didn't even have to share the actual maps themselves for this kind of practice to become well-known and widely practiced. And I should point out too, that HOLC didn't come up with this on their own. It was people coming from the real estate industry and academia into HOLC who put these practices into effect and then later carried them back out. So really, it's hard to make a distinction between government and private industry. They are completely intertwined in ways that we're only just beginning to appreciate now.
So the next question I have is, did HOLC invent redlining, or perhaps it's the National Association Real Estate Board? What's that all about?
Yes. Another article that I'm working on right now with a colleague, we were exploring the kind of intellectual origins of redlining, and it's very interesting. It turns out there was an economist named Richard T. Ely who started an institute for land economics at the University of Wisconsin in 1920, and he basically carried these theories to the National Association of Real Estate Boards. He himself was a real estate investor. He saw large numbers of African Americans moving to northern cities during the World War I era, during the Great Migration. And he began to have fears that this was going to have a negative impact on property values. Eli himself was a member of the native-born white intelligentsia who believed in things like social Darwinism, eugenics. Remember, this is the height of the Jim Crow era. And so there's this idea of a hierarchy of races. And this is where these kinds of supposed scientific laws come into play. And Eli got the National Institute of Real Estate Boards, or NAREB, to authorize him to make their educational materials. So he was passing these ideas to them. He's also training many other professors who went to other institutions and trained a whole generation of realtors. The National Association of Real Estate Boards actually trademarked this term realtor, where you're not allowed to use that term unless you're a member of their organization. And they excluded, of course, African Americans, also Jews, and really anyone who didn't meet their kind of standards of membership. They were trying to make real estate a more respectable profession. It had kind of a bad reputation in the late 19th century as being kind of exploitative, taking advantage of widows and people who weren't very savvy to turn a quick buck. So they were trying to make it a more respectable, kind of middle-class oriented profession, and they did that by excluding. And so they and Eli really worked hand in hand to institutionalize these ideas and practices and to give them some kind of intellectual heft. And then a lot of Eli's students wound up taking jobs at HOLC and at the Federal Housing Administration. People like Ernest Fisher, people like Homer Hoyt, and Frederick Babcock. These were people who wrote textbooks about real estate values and why, as they call it, infiltration by undesirable elements was kind of the shorthand they used, or more polite form of racism they used, where they argued that this would inevitably lower property values. And this sunk really deep into the white middle class consciousness. I would argue it's still with us to this very day. Even if the government has not been promoting redlining for the last 50 years explicitly, even if we've tried to become less racist in our thinking, there's still this assumption that if a neighborhood becomes too heavily African-American, white people feel like property values are going to go down. So that really gives a sense of how long-lasting these ideas were and the damage that Eli did by promoting these theories and passing them along in this way.
There's no evidence that he was like a member of the Klan. He was just more of a more respectable racist than the kind of on the ground ignorant racist. He was using the science and that kind of stuff, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan had a big resurgence in the 1920s, and that was more of a maybe lower middle class, like a lot of shopkeepers and skilled tradesmen were afraid that African Americans and immigrants were going to take their jobs. Eli was more of a kind of upper class racist. For example, he was approached in 1909 after the Springfield, Illinois riot, whites rioted and attacked the African American community there, and that led to the formation of the NAACP. Mm-hmm. So some white reformers were sympathetic to Black civil rights, and they invited Eli to come to the founding convention that led to the formation of the NAACP. And he said something to the effect, I don't think, I'm not that interested in the Negro problem. I think my talents could be spent elsewhere. And we know from his lectures that he gave at Wisconsin and this Institute for Land Economics, we know that he was disturbed by the appearance of large numbers of African Americans beginning during World War I, and all Black neighborhoods starting to materialize like Harlem in New York City. So he was aware of this. It's sometimes hard to pin him down on these matters, but he surely believed in eugenics, this idea of kind of selective breeding, to improve the kind of genetic quality. This was an idea that was very popular among the kind of white intelligentsia at the time. And one of his students, Edmund Ross, was one of the leading sociologists who promoted eugenics. So we know that Eli was involved in that as well.
So you mentioned the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. How did they engage in redlining or promote it, or did they?
Okay, the Federal Housing Administration was established through the Housing Act of 1934. So it was established 1 year after HOLC, and they actually had a different approach to subsidizing housing than HOLC did. So again, HOLC flat out bought mortgages and then issued a refinanced mortgage. And HOLC therefore actually owned people's houses until it was scaled down and liquidated by 1951. What FHA did was to insure lenders and developers against loss. So they oversaw an insurance fund, and interestingly, developers and lenders would actually pay into this themselves. So it was kind of an ingenious way to intervene in the housing market in a way that didn't cost taxpayers a lot of money, and it kind of stimulated the private housing market. So basically what they would do is they would, if a developer met their stringent standards for the kind of development they were going to build, they would guarantee them against loss through this fund. So that meant banks were willing to were willing to lend on longer term loans that were more favorable to buyers. So very quickly up to a 30-year term. So this idea of a mortgage being 30 years, that's a relatively recent development. And by the FHA making it safe for these developers to build suburban housing developments and making especially large-scale institutional lenders willing to lend for 30 years, it really boosted the post-World War II housing market, because even though this was passed in 1934, it wasn't really able to take off until after World War II. So really, the FHA is behind a lot of that post-war suburban boom, bringing homeownership within reach of a lot of Americans who never could have contemplated it. And basically who we're talking about is the white working class. Most white working class Americans were renters before the Depression. Now it was actually cheaper to buy a house in one of these FHA-backed developments than to rent. Now, who did that leave out? It left out overwhelmingly African Americans, because these stringent standards that the FHA enforced to be eligible for this loan insurance program, this is actually called guarantees. They included things like standard lot sizes, square footage, a certain number of bedrooms per number of members of the family who are going to be occupying the home, what amenities it had to have. And so it helped a lot to standardize and bring down the cost of housing. But one of the restrictions also that it required was it wouldn't guarantee any building in racially mixed areas. So this is a key example of the government openly enforcing a racist requirement. And it also favors the suburbs, because it's easier to start from scratch with all these restrictions on new land instead of trying to do that in an already developed area. So they're going to vacant land at the periphery, the edges of the cities, or even in the suburbs, that's farmland. You know, someplace like Levittown was a potato field before it became housing. They're dividing up the land. They're putting in these racially restrictive deeds, and then they're building standardized housing, almost like on an assembly line, so an industrial scale. That allows them to reduce down the cost, and they're able to offer this on a longer term at a lower interest rate and with lower down payments than ever had happened before. We could talk a little bit about the pre-New Deal mortgage market, but it was nothing like this. Banks just were not willing to lend for such a long term until the FHA was guaranteeing them against loss. But part of that guarantee was that no people of color would be moving into these areas. Now, the NAACP discovered that the FHA was doing this relatively early. In 1936, the FHA published an underwriter's manual. And this laid out all the different kinds of specifications that needed to be followed to be eligible for this mortgage insurance. And it explicitly stated that racial restrictions were recommended and that the FHA would not lend in any racially mixed areas of occupancy. So the NAACP got their hands on a copy of this, and in 1938 started making inquiries directly to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, asking, what is this? And he was a little cagey. I've actually seen the letter that he wrote saying the FHA works completely within the boundaries of the law. But fairly soon after that, lawsuits started getting filed, and the NAACP and the Urban League led the fight against restrictive covenants and deed restrictions. Starting in 1940, there was a favorable ruling, and then that went through with another favorable ruling in 1944, and in 1948, the Supreme Court in Shelley versus Kramer ruled that these kinds of arrangements between white property owners were not enforceable. It didn't yet say that they were illegal. Later it would say that, but at this point just said that these are not enforceable. And so that put the FHA in a position where they could no longer recommend deed restrictions as a way to supposedly protect the long-term value of these neighborhoods. So by 1950, the FHA started, they took all the racial specific language out of their manuals and things like that. But significantly, they continued to guarantee these developers and lenders that discriminated. There was a real famous case in Stuyvesant Town in New York City. It was a huge development built, I think, in Upper Manhattan, backed by one of the largest, I think it was backed by Prudential life insurance company. And they very prominently disallowed any Black people from purchasing. And the FHA backed that, even despite Shelley versus Kramer. And so, African American civil rights groups and white liberals also kept applying pressure to try and get the government to stop guaranteeing these loans. And in 1960, when John F. Kennedy ran for president, he promised that he would desegregate any federally backed programs with the stroke of a pen. That was one of the campaign slogans from 1960. It wasn't until 1962 that he himself actually took that measure. And that's also when we desegregated public housing, by the way. Up until that point, for all intents and purposes, public housing was segregated by race as well. So in 1962, the government says it will not continue to financially back these developers. But again, it's not until 1968 when we have a Fair Housing Act. So you can get some sense really of how drawn out this process is, and really kind of kicking and screaming, and how civil rights groups had to lobby and basically force the government to do the right thing over this 30-year period.
Well, that kind of brings me to the next question. Many authors, including Kevin Cruz in the 1619 Project, have placed most of the blame for redlining on the government. But doesn't this let private corporations off the hook? Aren't they the ones mostly benefiting? And how do you feel about that emphasis on government only?
Well, I do think it is extremely disturbing that the federal government itself did sign off on this and promote these kinds of racist practices. But in a more practical sense, if you were going to make a legal case against this and sue someone, or maybe seek reparations, as some progressive Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Elizabeth Warren have talked about, finding some way to make amends for redlining, the government makes a much better target, because we know so much about HOLC. There are hundreds of boxes in the National Archives of HOLC records showing exactly how they did this city survey. And we know so much more about that. Those are the property of the American people, so anybody can go in there and look at that. You can now look online for this evidence. It's just harder to document private practices. And a lot of what we know about redlining by private industry is more, it's more deductive. it's more based on what we can see of the effects. We can see certain areas are not getting loans, right? So it's very rare that you'll be able to go in and look in a boardroom and hear them say, we're not going to give a loan to this Black neighborhood because we might lose our money, or Black people don't take care of their homes, or whatever horrible things they might be saying. You almost never are privy to that. And then corporations very seldom donate those records to an archive where historians would be able to find that evidence. It's very few and far between. So just out of practicality, we know so much more about the government, and that's where we would focus our efforts if we were going to try and make amends for these past policies. But that's not to let private industry off the hook in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I would argue that private industry is probably more culpable, because those are the ones who are actually funding the vast majority of these mortgages and continuing to try and find ways to discriminate really up to this very day. Just last week, the Trump administration has proposed some amendments to the Community Reinvestment Act. And they're basically trying to relax the reporting requirements on banks that could lead to the reinstitution of practices like redlining if we're not very careful. And so, again, that's something we can attack government for. It's harder to try and press the case against private industry, although we have been able to in some significant cases.
So what do you think private industry and their redlining practices, what do you think of those, and how do we stay vigilant against them, I guess? Or...
I mentioned in 1968 that we got a Fair Housing Act, which made these practices illegal. That was not very robust as it was passed, but it's been strengthened, especially in 1988. There were some amendments that made that stricter. And in 1975, we had a Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which required banks to report where were they making mortgages. And so that started to give a picture of really just how targeted these patterns of investment were and how discriminatory companies were. And then that was followed up by the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. And this came, again, through the efforts of local activists. Starting in the late 1960s, neighborhood groups started pushing. They already knew that they were being discriminated against, and that cities were not getting the same funds that were available to suburbs. Things like urban renewal and highways were negatively impacting their communities. So they started pushing for banks to open the books. And again, they are not always successful in getting that smoking gun kind of evidence that we would like. But they lobbied to the point where Congress passed this Community Reinvestment Act. And that, again, it requires companies to be more transparent. And then also it incentivizes lending back into some of the areas that had been starved of investment previously. I seem to recall there was some $6 trillion redirected into areas that had previously been starved of credit since the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. So that gives you some sense. It's not a perfect tool, by the way. For one thing, it's more on the basis of geography than it is on the basis of race. But still, it is the most valuable tool that we have to try and reverse the kind of negative effects that have come from redlining, and to start to equalize the playing field. And if the Trump administration does succeed in loosening those reporting requirements and disincentivizing lending to urban areas, we're going to start probably to go back in the same direction that the country's urban areas took from the 1940s into the 1960s. Alternatively, these banks may cherry pick, what areas they would like to invest in without doing so in an equitable basis. So that's why redlining continues to be such a vital issue today. Companies are always finding new ways to discriminate. We've got more powerful digital and computer-based tools than ever before to come up with these kinds of determinations. And so we need this more than ever before. If anything, the Community Reinvestment Act should be strengthened, not weakened. I do talk about this a little bit in my book, Surrogate Suburbs. I also published a article in Cleveland Scene magazine called Beyond White Flight. And that came out in the summer of 2017. That focuses on the Lee Harvard neighborhood, in a particular house. It was the first house in that neighborhood that a Black family moved into, and it created a huge stir. But I wanted to get into some of the background and break out of this idea that there's this inevitable, trend toward white flight, that we could imagine a different future. It doesn't have to be this way. If we could understand really some of these complicated details that we've been talking about today, of why things turned out the way that they have, then we can start to think about how we might do things differently in the future, and possibly how we can make some kind of amends for past policies. I have some other articles too on redlining specifically that you could probably find on the internet if anyone's interested to learn more. And I would highly recommend, especially the Mapping Inequality website. It's a really fantastic digital resource where you can look at redlining maps for, I think, about 150 cities around the country. And you can also click on those neighborhoods and read some of the really offensive language used to disparage the inhabitants of these areas on the basis of race, ethnicity, and other grounds. It's really quite shocking, and I would highly recommend that you go in and read some of those neighborhood descriptions.